Hi, welcome to my kitchen. This is Leslie, and today we're going to be making some whole grain, whole wheat bread. There's a lot of religion in a loaf of bread, and that means that it requires patience, it requires skill, and then we often will have a nice product that we can share with others and be a blessing to them too. So let's get going. We're going to be making this bread in a Zojirusi bread machine today, but most bread machines are going to work about the same. So let's get going. If you have the choice of the bread machine that you're getting, I like to get a pan that has removable paddles. And the reason for that is we will remove these paddles before we start to bake the bread so that we don't end up with big holes in the bottom of the bread. So removable is great. Also, we're not going to need to spray this whole pan. They usually have a non-stick finish in them, which makes it really easy for baking. All right, so to begin with, the liquid ingredients go into the pan first. So I have 1 1/4 cups of water, and it doesn't have to be preheated or anything like that because the bread machine will preheat everything. And then I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of oil, and I like to use olive oil. So put 1 tablespoon of oil in the bread, and that helps to add to the moisture of the bread and keep the bread moist, and it helps the crumb to stay nice as well. Our next ingredient is going to be whole wheat flour. Now I like to grind my own whole wheat flour, but you can buy some nice quality whole wheat flours as well. And when you're making bread, the humidity makes a difference on how much flour you're actually going to need in the bread. So I'm not going to add all of the flour at first. I'm going to just add maybe a cup less than what the recipe calls for to begin with, and then we'll add flour during the kneading process. So this calls for 2 1/2 cups of whole wheat flour. So I'm just going to go ahead and try to make it level. You can use a knife to level the top if you like. I'm just kind of shaking it a little bit because this isn't precision on the flour. It's going to go a lot by appearance of the dough. So I'm going to put in that first cup, and then I'm going to put in about another 1/2 cup or a little bit more of the whole wheat flour. Sprinkle that right in there over the moist. Our next ingredient will be gluten flour. Now you can make a loaf of bread, half whole wheat, half white to get a nice texture. But if you want to have more of the fiber and the nutrients from the whole grain flour, then it helps to have some gluten flour, which adds to the elasticity of the dough. And so you don't get large holes in the bread. This is also called dough pep. But gluten flour is readily available at health food stores, maybe even some grocery stores, and of course on Amazon. All right, so we're going to I'm going to put in 3 tablespoons of gluten flour, and I'm going to sprinkle that onto the whole wheat. I really don't want to get it wet because gluten flour, once it gets wet, sticks together like glue. And so I'm just going to sprinkle it in with this whole wheat for now. So I've got 3 tablespoons of the gluten flour. Or you could make this a half white, half whole wheat loaf and just skip the gluten flour. Next will be salt. You can reduce the salt if you want in your bread. It will definitely change the flavor. I'm going to add 1 1/2 teaspoons. 1 1/2. Kind of mix that in a little bit. And the next item is a sweetener. Now the reason why we need sweetener in the bread is not just for flavor. The sweetener that you use will feed the yeast, and it also will help to brown the loaf. So if in your machine you find that your bread is coming out too dark, the sugar in your bread may be caramelizing. And so you can cut back on the sugar, but you do need some sort of honey or sugar or maple syrup or something like that to feed the yeast. I'm just going to go ahead and use a non-bleached natural sugar here, and my recipe calls for 1 to 3 tablespoons, but my machine does make a very dark loaf. So I'm just going to add 1.5 tablespoons of sugar to this loaf so that I do not get incredible browning on it. Next, we're going to add 1/2 cup of rolled oats. And you could use any type of grain flake that you like. If you like barley flakes or rye flakes or oat flakes, you can add that. Oats are not a gluten grain, so they're not adding to the elasticity of the dough at all. So you could add any kind of other flake grain that you like, or you could omit it altogether. All right, lastly is the yeast. Now, we do not want that yeast to be in the fluid in the pan because the machine is going to pre-warm all the ingredients, and you don't want the yeast to be in there, start activating until it's time for it to be activating. I'm going to be using an instant yeast. So I don't have to proof it. Often if you're using an active yeast, you want to put some water and the sweetener in a measuring cup and see if it will foam. But when you're using an instant yeast, you do not have to do the proofing process. So I'm going to use that instant yeast, and I will be using 1.5, let me see. No, I'll be using 2 teaspoons of the instant yeast. But if you are using an active yeast, that would be 1.25 teaspoons. You don't need quite as much. So I buy it in bulk. It's relatively inexpensive. You can buy it at one of the big box stores and keep it in your refrigerator in a glass jar once you open it. Or if it comes in a 2-pack, put one of them in the freezer, and that will work quite well. So I've got my jar of yeast here, and I will add 2 teaspoons right on the top of the grains. There we go. And that's it. All our ingredients are in the pan except for the additional whole wheat flour that we will be adding to bring the dough up to the right consistency. So I'm going to move the pan into the machine, and it's going to have a little bit of a snap in there. And plug my machine in and lower my lid. All right. Now on my machine, I can select my coarse, and I can select my crust control. So I usually select light, and then because I'm using an instant yeast, I'm going to be going with quick and wheat. Now with a bread machine, I could do basic. That would be used if I'm using active yeast. And if I just wanted to make dough, say to make sweet rolls or pizza crust or something like that, then I would choose dough. But I'm gonna hit the buttons until I hit quick and yeast. So select coarse, quick, wheat. And so that'll give me 2 hours and 8 minutes for the entire process. And then I will just hit start. Now on my machine, I have a second knockdown of the dough, or a second punching down of the dough by the machine at 38 minutes. And that is just before it rises to bake. Now at that 38-minute mark, just before that final rising, I want to remove the dough from the pans and take out those paddles. So I have a timer, and I'm going to set my timer for about 38 minutes. And if you're off by a minute or two and you miss the knockdown by a minute, it's not that big of a deal. So in 38 minutes, I will be checking on that. Now, in the meanwhile, this is going to preheat. Then it's going to start mixing the dough. So it'll be just a couple of minutes until it preheats, and then we will begin that whole process of mixing the dough. So it's been maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and the bread machine has begun to slowly knead the bread. So it's just starting to mix up those ingredients, just to kind of incorporate them a little bit. So I can begin to add some of the whole wheat flour in here, and then it will be picking up the speed. And it's obvious this is going to be way too moist. So I'm going to go ahead and add about a half a cup right there and just let it incorporate that a little bit better. I want to give thanks to my friend Leonard for asking me, how do you make whole wheat bread? That inspired me to go ahead and put this video together for you. It's so fun to work with yeast. There's so many fun things you can do with it. You could take out the dough and use it to make sweet rolls. You could make pizza crust. You could shape it into buns. You could make mini loaves to share. You can add fruit and nuts to make delicious breads. You could make, your imagination is the limit on all the things you could do. You could make calzones. And just enjoy it. It's so fun to work the dough and to come back a little while later and see it all nice and puffed up, and you pull it out of the oven and it's golden brown. This, of course, will only make when to bake it, this will only bake a loaf of bread. It's not going to be able to bake your sweet rolls for you, but it can make the dough for you, which is 80% of the challenge of making bread. It's still going at the slower speed, but that's probably incorporated. So let's just take a peek. Still very wet. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more whole wheat flour. And we'll let that go a little bit more. Our goal is to get this into a soft dough that is just barely not sticky. We don't want it very dry because then the dough will be tough and hard. And we want it about the softness as a baby's bottom, they say. So we'll let this incorporate, and there is a window on the top that I can kind of peek in, sometimes even look in with a little flashlight if I'm trying to keep the heat in. But those paddles are working to knead that, and it's starting to form into a ball. So I will go ahead and add a little bit more here. And making bread is not like making a cake where you want to have precise measurements on your flour. So it becomes almost as much of an art to make just kicked into the higher speed. So it's going to start kneading that at a much higher speed. It feels like it's all incorporated. Let's just take a peek in. And there's a little bit of flour just along the bottom, and I'm just going to scrape that around a little bit. And make sure I don't like dried flour in the bottom of my bread. All right. It's still a little too sticky, and we can see that it's still a little bit sticky. But at this point, we just want to add small amounts, a couple of teaspoons to a tablespoon at a time. And yes, every time this stops, it is eating into that 38-minute time where I'm going to remove it from the pan. So it's an approximation. We just don't want to leave this open a long time. Just open it up just to do the quick additions that you need to do, and then shut it right back up again, and you'll only be off by a minute or two if you do it that way. Look at that. We are definitely getting there. Just a tiny, tiny little bit more. All right. We'll let this incorporate, and we'll do a last check on it. Hopefully it'll be the last check. It's looking pretty good. Looking pretty good. Just a little tiny bit too sticky yet. Just, can you see that it's a little bit moist here, moister than it should be anyway. Just a little bit more. And although this takes a little time, it can make a huge difference between a loaf that is too dry so it doesn't rise well, or a loaf that is too wet and collapses in the middle. So our goal is to get that sweet spot with the dough. All right, one little bit more, like a teaspoon or two. Look at that. Look at that. Formed into a nice ball there. Got just a little bit of flour. I'm going to mix that around a little bit, move it so that the dough will pick it up. But here we have a nice ball of dough. That was our goal. All right. Now we're going to let this machine run. It will knead for a while. Then it will stop kneading and rise. And it will knock it down and let it rise again. So when we get to that 38-minute mark, or approximately around there, it'll run like this, but it'll just go womp womp just a couple of times. And then I know to take it out of the pan, remove those paddles, shape the loaf, and put it back in. So we'll come back and do all that in just about a half an hour. So that was the sound of our knockdown. So that's just before the final rise. Oh, that dough looks lovely. Nice ball. What I'm going to do is just spray my hands just a little and get this dough out. And then I'm going to remove the paddles. It's not going to be kneading anymore at all. If your little pegs stick, just put a little bit of spray on your finger, or just spray it and just give them a little wipe there. Now we'll go ahead and shape the loaf. I want the dough to be nice and smooth on the top. So I'm going to just put a tiny little spray on here. Oh, the dough feels lovely. Pull it back. Kind of roll it. Now this nice smooth side is the side that we're going to put up in the pan. All right, we're ready to put this back in the machine. Just lay it right in there. Put the cover down. And next time we come back, it will be all risen and ready to take out of the machine. See you then. Ah, the golden moment has arrived. Let's see how it came out. Ah, that's good. Let's get the camera over here and you can see what this bread looks like. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and tap it out. These pans are very hot. So make sure you use pot holders. Okay, so we do get a little bit of a little hole. You can see just a little bit of the dough stuck to the bottom, but not much. If you would have left the paddles in there, we get big holes. It's definitely worth it. All right, let's flip this over. And we have a beautiful loaf of bread. Now, if you want a larger loaf, you just increase the proportions of the dough. So don't go Don't increase it double because that will make it way too big. But play with it according to the size of your bread machine. And I hope that you will end up with a beautiful loaf of bread. So what I'm going to do now is put the loaf on a cooling rack so that it doesn't sweat. Move this. And then I'm going to use a clean dish towel and just cover it to allow it to cool. Now what that will do is keep a small amount of moisture on the crust to make the crust a little bit softer. If you would like, you can put oil or something like that on the crust, but I prefer not to add that extra oil or fat to the loaf. Once it's cooled, I'm going to wait a little while. I think the next day the crumb is better. So when you go to slice it, it's a nicer quality bread. It also gives some of the yeast gases a chance to evaporate. And then have a slice and share one with a friend. And now for the moment we've all been waiting for. Drum roll, please. I would say invest in a nice bread knife if you're going to make your own bread. This bread is beautiful. It's soft. I can slice it thin and it holds together. It's flexible. It's beautiful. Go ahead, make your own and enjoy. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this will be a future experiment for you. So go ahead down and get yourself a bread machine. We got one of our zojirushis from a friend. A dear friend Phyllis gave us one. And then we got a second one at a Goodwill or something like that for about $5. So they are usually in the thrift stores. And so it's a small investment, and then you can have wonderful, chemical-free, quality, homemade, whole grain bread. Enjoy. God bless.